Oh, my mic was muted. Hello, hello. Let me just adjust my settings here real quick. All right. So it is officially December, and I thought it would be nice if we did some reading content over here. And I'm a huge fan of just like classical literature. I took like every English class you could have possibly taken in school. Um, so I thought it would be fun to kind of share a beloved classic of Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, just to kind of, read, hang out, vibe, get in the mood for the season. So I hope you guys have been doing good. But yes, I made my room nice and cozy. I got my reading glasses on. Actually, let me put my actual reading glasses on because Lord knows I'm blind. 1 second. Okay. Settle in, get cozy, grab a snack, cozy blanket, the nearest cat if available. And here we go with chapter 1, or rather stave 1. So this is the original, I believe it's the where is it? It says it on top. 1943 edition of A Christmas Carol. I'm actually curious. Let's get some history here about A Christmas Carol. I always love knowing the history of books. Sorry, my keyboard is so loud. I actually asked for a new one for Christmas that's a little bit more quiet just to make this easier. Let's dive into the history of A Christmas Carol real quick. So, A Christmas Carol was written by Charles Dickens in 1843 as social commentary on the Victorian era's poverty and the harsh realities of the Industrial Revolution. The novella was a response to widespread social inequality and child labor, and Charles Dickens wrote it in a rush, aiming for a political pamphlet that would have a story that was forced to raise public consciousness. The book was an immediate success, with its first printing selling out by Christmas Eve, and has influenced Christmas traditions and perceptions of charity. We love books that do good things for society, and a story as a classic as A Christmas Carol definitely still speaks true to this day. And with a lot of the things going on in this world right now, it's, I think, kind of like a good refresher just of like, hey, especially around the holidays, like, let's, be conscious of everybody and know that, be thankful for what you have, because life is short and you got to treasure it while you have it. So without further ado, let's get into the original 1843 edition of A Christmas Carol. Sorry, I'm trying to get my eyes to focus here. All right. So chapter 1, Marley's Ghost. Marley was dead, to begin with. There is no doubt whatsoever about that. The register of his burial was signed by the clergyman, the clerk, the undertaker, and the chief mourner. Scrooge signed it, and Scrooge's name was upon good change for anything he chose to put his hand to. And old Marley was as dead as a doornail. Mind, I don't mean to say that I know of my own knowledge what there is particularly dead about a doornail. I might have been inclined myself to regard a coffin nail as the deadest piece of ironmongery in the trade. But the wisdom of our ancestors is in the simile, and my unhallowed hand shall not disturb it, or the country's done for. You will therefore permit me to repeat, emphatically, that Marley was as dead as a doornail. Scrooge knew he was dead. Of course he did. How could it be otherwise? Scrooge and he were partners for I don't know how many years. Scrooge was his sole executor, his sole administrator, and his sole assigned, as well as his sole residuary legatee, his sole friend and sole mourner. And even Scrooge was not dreadfully cut up by the sad event, but that he was an excellent man of business on the very day of the funeral, and solemnized it with an undoubted bargain. Sorry, my eyes keep twitching. I keep trying to... Let me actually fix my camera just a little. See if that helps. It's because I'm looking at my Kindle. That's what I read off of. See, is that better? A little. That works. The mention of Marley's funeral brings me back to the point I started from. There is no doubt that Marley was dead. This must be distinctly understood, or nothing wonderful can come of the story I'm going to relate. If we were not perfectly convinced that Hamlet's father died before the play began, there would be nothing more remarkable in his taking a stroll at night, in an easterly wind upon his own ramparts than there would be in any other middle-aged gentleman rashly turning out after dark in a breezy spot, say St. Paul's churchyard, for instance, literally to astonish his son's weak mind. Scrooge never painted out old Marley's name. There it stood, years afterwards, above the warehouse door. Scrooge and Marley. The firm was known as Scrooge and Marley. Sometimes people knew the business to be called Scrooge, and sometimes Marley. But he answered to both names. It was all the same to him. Oh, but he was a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone, Scrooge, a squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner, hard and sharp as flint, from which no steel had ever struck out a generous fire, secret and self-contained, and solitary as an oyster. The cold within him froze his old features, nipped at his pointed nose, his shriveled cheek, stiffened his gait, made his eyes red and his thin lips blue, and spoke out shrewdly in his grating voice. A frosty rime was on his head, and on his eyebrows a wiry chin. He carried his own... skip the page. He carried his own lone temperature always about him. He iced his office in the dog days and didn't thaw it at 1 degree, even at Christmas. External heat and cold had little influence on Scrooge. No warmth could warm the wintry weather chill within him. No wind that blew was bitterer than he. No falling snow was more intent upon its purpose. No pelting rain less open to entreaty. Sorry, I keep trying to fix my eyes. My goodness. Trying to make them twitch a little less with me reading. There you go. Perhaps it's better. Foul weather didn't know where to have him. The heaviest rain and snow and hail and sleet could boast of the advantage over him in only one respect. They often came down handsomely, and Scrooge never did. Nobody ever stopped him in the street to say with gladsome looks, "My dear Scrooge, how are you? When will you come to see me?" No beggars implored him to bestow a trifle. No children asked him what o'clock it was. No man or woman ever once in all his life inquired the way to such and such a place of Scrooge. Even the blind man's dogs appeared to know him, and when they saw him coming on, would tug their owners to doorways and up courts, and then would never wag their tails as though they said, "No eye at all is better than the evil eye, dark master." But what did Scrooge care? It was the very thing he liked, to edge his way along the crowded path of life, warning all human sympathy to keep its distance. What was the knowing ones call nuts to Scrooge? Once upon a time, of all the good days in the year, on Christmas Eve, old Scrooge sat busy in his counting house. It was cold, bleak, biting weather, foggy withal, and he could hear the people in the court outside go wheezing up and down, beating their hands upon their breasts and stamping their feet on the pavement and stones to warm them. The city clocks had only gone to 3, but it was quite dark already. It had not been light all day, and the candles were flaring in the windows of the neighboring offices like ruddy smears upon the palpable brown air. The fog came pouring in at every chink and keyhole. Let me actually make my brightness a little brighter. Hold on. Uno momento. Keyhole. Don't lose your place. My Kindle still thinks I'm traveling. 1 second. Brightness. There we go. Yeah, last I was reading, I was on a plane. So, let's see. Where was I? Okay. Excuse me. The fog came pouring in at every chink and keyhole, and was so dense without that, although the court of the narrowest, the houses opposite were mere phantoms. To see the dingy cloud come drooping down, obscuring everything, one might have thought that nature lived hard and was brewing on a large scale. The door of Scrooge's counting house was open, and that he might keep his eye upon the clerk, who in a dismal little cell beyond a sort of tank was copying letters. Scrooge had a very small fire, but the clerk's fire was so very much smaller that it looked like one coal. But he couldn't replenish it. for Scrooge kept in the coal box in his own room. And so surely as the clerk came in with the shovel, the master predicted that it would be necessary for them to part. Wherefore the clerk put on his white comforter and tried to warm himself at the candle, in which effort, not being a man of strong imagination, he failed. "A Merry Christmas, Uncle. God save you," cried a cheerful voice. It was the voice of Scrooge's nephew, who came upon him so quickly that this was the first intimation he had of his approach. "Bah!" said Scrooge. "Humbug." He had so heated himself with rapid walking in the fog and frost, this nephew of Scrooge's, that he was all in a glow. His face was ruddy and handsome, his eyes sparkled, and his breath smoked again. "Christmas a humbug, Uncle," said Scrooge's nephew. "You don't mean that, I am sure." "I do," said Scrooge. "Merry Christmas! What right have you to be merry? What reason have you to be merry? You're poor enough." "Come, then," replied the nephew gaily. "What right have you to be so dismal? What reason have you to be so morose? You're rich enough." Scrooge, having no better answer ready on the spur of the moment, said "Bah!" again, and followed it up with "Humbug." "Don't be so cross, Uncle," said the nephew. "What else can I be," returned the uncle, "when I live in such a world of fools as this? Merry Christmas! Out upon Merry Christmas! What Christmas time do you have but a time for paying bills without money, a time for finding yourself a year older, but not an hour richer, a time for balancing your books and having every item in 'em through around a dozen of months presented dead against you? If I could work my will," said Scrooge indignantly, "every idiot who goes about with Merry Christmas on his lips should be boiled in his own pudding and buried with a stake of holly through his heart, he should." "Uncle!" pleaded his nephew. "Nephew!" returned the uncle sternly. "Keep Christmas in your own way, and let me keep it in mine." "Keep it," repeated Scrooge's nephew. "But you don't keep it." "Leave me alone, then," said Scrooge. "Much good it may do you, much good it has ever done you. There are many things from which I might have derived, by which I have not profited, I dare say," returned the nephew. "Christmas among the rest, but I am sure I have always thought of Christmas time, when it has come around, apart from the veneration, that's a big word for Elmo. Let's see, what's this? I'm so stupid, I'm sorry. So one of the things I do like about the Kindle, and I have a Kindle Paperweight 2022, is it actually has a dictionary feature. So it's actually really nifty whenever you come across a word that you're not familiar with or you don't really see on the daily. So veneration is one of those. So let me actually see. What is the dictionary definition? Venerate or veneration means regard to great respect or revere. Okay, so it's just like the action of revering something. So the sample sentence that it gave me here is Mother Teresa is venerated as a saint. See note at revere. So that I guess means just another way of keeping something sacred or just, to revere something. Ooh, new vocabulary word today. Apart from the veneration due to its sacred name and origin, if anything belonging to it can be apart from that, as good a time, a kind, forgiving, charitable, pleasant time, the only time I know of in the long calendar of the year when men and women seem by one consent to open up their shut-in hearts freely and to think of people below them as if they really were fellow passengers to the grave, and not another race of creatures bound on other journeys. And therefore, uncle, though it has never put a scrap of gold or silver in my pocket, I believe that it has done me good and will do me good. And I say, God bless it. The clerk in the tank involuntarily applauded. He just stands. Becoming immediately sensible of the impropriety, he poked the fire and extinguished the last frail spark forever. "Let me hear another sound from you," said Scrooge, "and you'll keep your Christmas by losing your situation. You're quite a powerful speaker, sir," he added, turning to his nephew. "I wonder you don't go into Parliament." "Don't be angry, uncle. Come, dine with us tomorrow." Scrooge said that he would see him, and yes, indeed he did. He went the whole length of the expression and said that he would see him in that extremity first. "But why?" cried Scrooge's nephew. "Why? Why did you get married?" said Scrooge. He said, "Sir, the fact that you got a family that's a sounds like a you problem." Dang. And yes, I have read A Christmas Carol before, but the last time I read it, I was in like the 7th or 8th grade, so it's been a minute, but I have read this before. "Why did you get married?" said Scrooge. "Because I fell in love." "Because you fell in love," growled Scrooge, as if that were the only thing in the world more ridiculous than a Merry Christmas. "Good afternoon." "Nay, uncle, but you never came to see me before that happened. Why give it a reason for not coming now?" "Good afternoon," said Scrooge. "I want nothing from you. I ask nothing of you. Why cannot we be friends?" "Good afternoon," said Scrooge. "I am sorry, with all my heart. We have never had any quarrel to which I have been a party. But I have made the trial in homage to Christmas, and I will keep my Christmas humor to the last. So, a Merry Christmas, uncle." "Good afternoon," said Scrooge. "And a Happy New Year." "Good afternoon," said Scrooge. His nephew left the room without an angry word, notwithstanding. He stopped at the outer door to bestow the greetings of the season on the clerk, who, cold as he was warmer than Scrooge, for he returned them cordially. "There is another fellow," muttered Scrooge, who overheard him. "My clerk with 15 shillings a week, and a wife and a family talking about a Merry Christmas. I'll retire to Bedlam." This lunatic, in letting Scrooge's nephew out, had let 2 other people in. They were portly gentlemen, pleasant to behold, and now stood with their hats off in Scrooge's office. They had books and papers in their hands, and bowed to him. "Scrooge and Marley's, I believe," said one of the gentlemen, referring to his list. "Have I the pleasure of addressing Mr. Scrooge or Mr. Marley?" "Mr. Marley has been dead these 7 years," Scrooge replied. "He died 7 years ago, this very night." "We have no doubt his liberality is well represented by his surviving partner," said the gentleman, presenting his credentials. It certainly was, for they had been 2 kindred spirits. At the ominous word liberality, Scrooge frowned, and shook his head, and handed the credentials back. "At this festive season of the year, Mr. Scrooge," said the gentleman, taking up a pen, "it is more than usually desirable that we should make some slight provision for the poor and destitute, who suffer greatly at the present time. Many thousands are in want of common necessities. Hundreds of thousands are in want of comfort, sir." "Are there no prisons?" asked Scrooge. "Plenty of prisons," said the gentleman, laying down the pen again. "And the union workhouses?" demanded Scrooge. "Are they still in operation?" "They are still," returned the gentleman. "I wish I could say they were not." "The treadmill and the poor law are in full vigor, then?" said Scrooge. "Both very busy, sir." "Oh, I was afraid from what you said at first that something had occurred to stop them in their useful course," said Scrooge. "I'm very glad to hear it." "Under the impression that they scarcely furnish Christian cheer of mind and body to the multitude," returned the gentleman, "a few of us are endeavoring to raise a fund to buy the poor some meat and drink and means of warmth. We choose this time because it is a time of all others when want is keenly felt, and of abundance rejoices. What shall I put you down for?" "Nothing," Scrooge replied. "You wish to be anonymous?" "I wish to be left alone," said Scrooge. "Since you ask me what I wish, gentlemen, that is my answer. I do not make merry myself at Christmas, and I can't afford to make idle people merry. I help to support the establishments I have mentioned. They cost enough, and those who are badly off must go there. Many can't go there, and many would rather die." "If they would rather die," said Scrooge, "they had better do it, and decrease the surplus population. Besides, excuse me, I don't know that." "But you might know it," observed the gentleman. "It is not my business," Scrooge returned. "It is enough for a man to understand his own business, and to not interfere with other people's. Mine occupies me constantly. Good afternoon, gentlemen." Seeing clearly that it would be useless to pursue their point, the gentleman withdrew. Scrooge resumed his labors with an improved opinion of himself, and in a more facetious temper than was usual to him. Meanwhile, the fog and darkness thickened so that the people ran about with flaring links, proffering their services to go before horses and carriage and conduct them on their way. The ancient tower of a church whose gruff old bell was always peeping slyly? Peeping slyly. What does that mean? Because I'm like, I don't think it means sleekily. Sneakily? Is that a word? Is sneakily a word? Sneakily. Let's see. Slyly. S-L-I-L-Y. Well, clearly it's a word. It's in the dictionary. Okay, no, I was right. I was like slyly, as in like sly, like cunning. So he's calling the the Gothic arches of the church cunning because it means having or showing a cunning or deceitful nature. The example sentence is, see sly, she had a sly personality. So he's saying, those sneaky church arches, creepin'. Bell always peeping, the bell. So the bell was peeping slyly down at Scrooge out of a Gothic window in the wall, became invisible and struck the hours and quarters in the clouds, with tremulous vibrations afterwards, as if its teeth were chattering in its frozen head up there. The cold became intense. In the main street, at the corner of the court, some laborers were repairing the gas pipes, and had lighted a great fire in a brazier, round which a party of ragged men and boys were gathered, warming their hands and winking their eyes before the blaze in rapture. The water plug being left in solitude, its overflowing sullenly congealed, and turned into misanthropic ice. Misanthropic. That's a big word for Elmo. Let's see. Misanthropic. That's one I don't hear every day. Misanthropic. A person who dislikes humankind and avoids society. There's your $5 Scrabble word for the day. Misanthropic. MISANTHROPIC. Misanthropic ice. It's interesting that it's being used to describe ice when it refers mostly to like a person who like dislikes other people so strongly that they're like, ooh. Well, there you go. So next time you have somebody being rude, you can be like, check your misanthropic attitude and just carry on with your day. Anyways, moving on from there. The brightness of the shops were holly sprigs, and berries crackled in the lamp heat of the windows, made pale faces ruddy as they passed. Poulterers' and grocers' trades became a splendid joke, a glorious pageant with which it had next to impossible to believe that such dull principles as bargain and sale had anything to do. The Lord Mayor, in the stronghold of the mighty mansion house, gave orders to his 50 cooks and butlers to keep Christmas as a Lord Mayor's household should. And even the little tailor, whom he had fined 5 shillings on the previous Monday for being drunk and bloodthirsty in the streets, stirred up tomorrow's pudding in his garret, while his lean wife and the baby sallied out to buy the beef. Foggier yet, and colder, piercing, searching, biting cold. If the good Saint Dunstan had been nipped the evil spirit's nose with a touch of such weather that instead of using his familiar weapons, then indeed would have roared to lusty purpose. The owner of one scant young nose, gnawed and mumbled by the hungry cold as his bones were gnawed by dogs, stooped down at Scrooge's keyhole to regale him with a Christmas carol, but at the first sound of God bless ye merry gentlemen, may you nothing but dismay, Scrooge seized the ruler with such an energy of action that the singer fled in terror, leaving the keyhole to the fog and even more congenial frost. At the length of the hour of shutting up the counting-house arrived. With an ill will, Scrooge dismounted from his stool and tacitly admitted the fact to the expectant clerk in the tank, who instantly snuffed out his candle and put his hat on. "You'll want all day tomorrow, I suppose," said Scrooge. "If quite convenient, sir." "It's not convenient," said Scrooge, "and it's not fair. If I was to stop, 1/2 for it, do you think yourself ill-used, I'll be bound?" The clerk smiled faintly. "And yet," said Scrooge, "you don't think me ill-used when I pay a day's wages for no work." The clerk observed that it was only once a year. "A poor excuse for picking a man's pocket every 25th of December," said Scrooge, buttoning his greatcoat to the chin. "But I suppose you must have the whole day. Be here all the earlier in the next morning." The clerk promised that he would, and Scrooge walked out with a growl. The office was closed in a twinkling, and the clerk, with the long ends of his white comforter dangling below his waist, for he boasted no greatcoat, went down on a slide on Cornhill at the end of the lane of boys, 20 times in honor of it being Christmas Eve, and then ran home to Camden Town as hard as he could pelt to play at Blind Man's Bluff. Scrooge took his melancholy dinner in his usual melancholy tavern, and having read all the newspapers and beguiled the rest of the evening with his banker's book, went home to bed. He lived in chambers which had once belonged to his deceased partner. Why are you living in your old deceased business partner's house? I wouldn't. Okay. I mean, to each their own, I guess. Maybe he had the better ring system. I don't know. They were a gloomy suite of rooms, in the lowering pile of buildings up a yard where it had so little business to be, that one could scarcely help fancying it. It must have run there when it was young house, playing hide-and-seek with other houses, and forgotten the way out again. It was old enough now, and dreary enough, for nobody lived in it but Scrooge, and the other rooms being all let out as offices. The yard was so dark that even Scrooge, who knew its every stone, was fain to grope with his hands. The fog and the frost so hung about the black old gateway of the house that it seemed as if the genius of the weather sat in mournful meditation on the threshold. Now, it is a fact that there was nothing at all in particular about the knocker on the door, except that it was very large. It also a fact that Scrooge had seen it, night and morning during his whole residence in that place. Also, that Scrooge had seen little of what is called fancy about him as any man in the city of London, including which is a bold word, the corporation, alderman, and livery. It is set also to be borne in mind that Scrooge had not bestowed one thought on Marley since his last mention of his 7 years dead partner that afternoon. And then let any man explain to me, if he can, how it happened that Scrooge, having his key in the lock of the door, saw in the knocker, without its undergoing any immediate process of change, not a knocker, but instead Marley's face. Marley's face. It was not an impenetrable shadow, as the other objects in the yard were, but had a dismal light about it, like a bad lobster in a dark cellar. Charles Dickens, did that happen to you? Did you find a random lobster in a dark cellar at one point in your life? Anyways. It was not angry or ferocious, but looked at Scrooge as Marley used to look, with ghostly spectacles turned up on its ghostly forehead. The hair was curiously stirred, as if by breath or hot air, and though the eyes were wide open, they were perfectly motionless. That and its livid color made it horrible, but its horror seemed to be in spite of the face beyond its control, rather than a part of its own expression. As Scrooge looked fixedly at this phenomenon, it was a knocker again. To say that he was not startled, or that his blood was not conscious of a terrible sensation to it, which had been a stranger from infancy, would be untrue. But he put his hand upon the key he had relinquished, turned it sturdily, walked in, and lighted his candle. He did pause, with a moment's irresolution, before he shut the door, and he did look cautiously behind it at first, as if he half expected to be terrified with the sight of Marley's pigtails sticking out into the hall. But there was nothing on the back of the door, except the screws and nuts that held the knocker on. So he said, "Pooh, pooh," and closed it with a bang. The sound resounded through the house like thunder. Every room above, and every cask in the wine merchant's cellar below, appeared to have a separate peal of echoes on its own. Scrooge was not a man to be frightened by echoes. He fastened the door, and walked across the hall, and up the stairs. Slowly, too, trimming his candle as he went. You may talk vaguely about driving a coach and six up a good old flight of stairs, or through a bad young Act of Parliament. But I mean to say, you might have gotten a hearse up in that staircase, and it taken broadwise with the splinter bar towards the wall and the door towards the balustrades, and done it easy. There was plenty and room and width for that to spare, which perhaps is the reason why Scrooge thought he saw a locomotive hearse going on before him in the gloom. So, translation there, because that was a mouthful to read, let alone understand. Basically, it's essentially saying he has a very wide, very large staircase, and he hallucinated seeing a hearse carriage going up there, like a ghostly hearse carriage. That's just the kind of quick and easy version of what he was seeing as he's going upstairs. Half a dozen gas lamps out of the street wouldn't have lighted the entry too well, so you may suppose that it was pretty dark with Scrooge's dip. Up Scrooge went, not caring a button for that. The darkness is cheap, and Scrooge liked it. The darkness is cheap, and Scrooge liked it. I'm sorry. Man said, Power Bill? Who? Don't know her. But before he shut his heavy door, he walked through his rooms to see that all was right. He had just enough recollection of the face to desire to do that. Sitting room, bedroom, lumber room. All as they should be. Nobody under the table, nobody under the sofa. A small fire in the grate, spoon and basin ready, and the little saucepan of gruel. Scrooge had a cold in his head upon the hob. Nobody under the bed, nobody in the closet, nobody in his dressing gown, which was hanging up in a spacious attitude against the wall. The lumber room as usual. Old fire guards, old shoes, 2 fish baskets, washing stand on 3 legs, and a poker. Quite satisfied, he closed the door and locked himself in, double-locked himself in, which was not his custom. Thus secured against surprise, he took off his cravat, put it on his dressing gown and slippers and his nightcap, and sat down before the fire taking his gruel. Gruel is basically like cough syrup, because it says he has a cold, and gruel, yeah, it's basically just like a liquid cough syrup, and you know what they say about Victorian cough syrup, that would cure anything. It actually wouldn't. There's a lot of dangerous stuff if you ever look it up. Don't take Victorian cough syrup. That stuff is against the FDA regulations today. It was a very low fire indeed. Nothing on such a bitter night. He was obliged to sit close to it and brood over it, before he could extract the least sensation of warmth from such a handful of fuel. The fireplace was an old one, built by some Dutch merchant long ago, and paved all around with quaint Dutch tiles designed to illustrate the scriptures. There were Cains and Abels, pharaohs and daughters, queens of Sheba, angelic messengers descending through the air on clouds like feather beds. Abrahams, Balthazars, apostles putting off into a sea in butter boats, hundreds of figures to attract his thoughts. And yet that face of Marley, 7 years dead, came like the ancient prophet's rod and swallowed up the whole. If each smooth tile had been a blanket first, with power to shape some picture on its surface from the disjointed fragments of his thoughts, there would have been a copy of old Marley's head on all of them. "Humbug," said Scrooge, and walked across the room. After several turns, he sat down again. As he threw his head back in the chair, his glance happened to rest upon a bell, a disused bell, that hung in the room. It communicated, for some purpose now forgotten, with a chamber in the highest story of the building. It was with great astonishment, and with a strange, inexplicable dread, that he looked and saw this bell begin to swing. It swung softly, in the outset that it scarcely made a sound, but soon it rang loudly, and so did every bell in the house. This might have lasted half a minute, but it seemed an hour. The bells ceased as they begun, together. They were succeeded by a clinking noise deep down below, as if some person were dragging a heavy chain over the cask of wine in the merchant's cellar. Scrooge then remembered to have heard that ghost-haunted houses were described as dragging chains. Ghosts that haunted houses were described dragging chains. The cellar door flew open with a booming sound, and then he heard the noise much louder on the floors below, then coming up the stairs, then coming straight towards his door. "It's humbug still," said Scrooge. "I won't believe it." His color changed, though, when without a pause it came through the heavy door and passed into the room right before his eyes. Upon its coming in, the dying flame leaped up as though it cried, "I know him, Marley's ghost," and fell again. The same face, the very same. Marley in his pigtail, usual waistcoat, tights and boots, the tassels on the latter bristling like his pigtail and his coat skirts, and the hair upon his head. The chain he drew was clasped around his middle. It was long and wound about him like a tail, and it was made, for Scrooge observed it closely, of cash boxes, keys, padlocks, ledgers, deeds, and heavy purses wrought in steel. His body was transparent, so that Scrooge, observing him and looking through his waistcoat, could see the 2 buttons on his coat behind. Scrooge had often heard it said that Marley had no bowels, but he never believed it until now. No, nor did he believe it even now. Though he looked the phantom through and through, he saw it standing before him. Though he felt the chilling influence of its death-cold eyes, and marked the very texture of the folded kerchief bound about his head and chin, which wrapper he had not observed before, he was still incredulous and fought against his senses. "How now?" said Scrooge, caustic and cold as ever. "What do you want with me?" "Much." Marley's voice. No doubt about it. "Who are you?" "Ask me who I was." "Who were you, then?" said Scrooge, raising his voice. "You're particular for a shade." He was going to say, to a shade, but substituted this as more appropriate. "In life, I was your partner, Jacob Marley." Can you sit down?" asked Scrooge, looking doubtfully at him. "I can." "Do it, then." Scrooge asked the question because he didn't know whether a ghost so transparent might find himself in a condition to take a chair, and felt that in the event of it being impossible, it might now involve the necessity of an embarrassing explanation. But the ghost sat down on the opposite side of the fireplace, as if he were quite used to it. "You don't believe in me," observed the ghost. "I don't," said Scrooge. "What evidence would you have on my reality beyond that of your senses?" "I don't know," said Scrooge. "Why do you doubt your senses?" "Because," said Scrooge, "a little thing affects them. A slight disorder of the stomach makes them cheats. You may be an undigested bit of beef, a blot of mustard, a crumb of cheese, a fragment of an underdone potato. There's more of gravy than of grave about you, whatever you are." Vans is really blaming seeing ghosts on indigestion. That's real. Scrooge was not much in the habit of cracking jokes, nor did he feel in his heart by any means waggish then. The truth is that he tried to be smart, as a means of distracting his own attention and keeping down his terror, for the spectre's voice disturbed the very marrow in his bones. To sit staring at those fixed, glazed eyes in silence for a moment would place Scrooge, and he felt the very deuce within him. There was something very awful, too, in this spectre, being provided with an infernal atmosphere of its own. Scrooge could not feel it himself, but this was very clearly the case, for though the ghost sat perfectly motionless, its hair, its skirts, and tassels were still agitated as though by an hot vapor of an oven. "Do you see this toothpick?" said Scrooge, returning quickly to the charge for the reason just assigned, and wishing through it were only for a second to divert the vision's stony gaze from himself. "I do," replied the ghost. "You are not looking at it," said Scrooge. "But I see it," said the ghost, "notwithstanding." "Well," returned Scrooge, "I have to swallow this, and be for the rest of my days persecuted by a legion of goblins, all of my own creation. Humbug, I tell you, humbug." At this, the spirit raised a frightful cry and shook its chain with a dismal and appalling noise that Scrooge held on tight to his chair to save himself from falling to a swoon. How much greater was his horror when the phantom, taking off the bandage around its head, as if it were just too warm to wear indoors, its lower jaw dropped down upon its chest. Scrooge fell upon his knees and clasped his hands before his face. "Mercy," he said. "Dreadful apparition, why do you trouble me?" "Man of the worldly mind," replied the ghost, "do you believe in me or not?" I do," said Scrooge. I must. But why do spirits walk the earth, and why do they come to me?" "It is required of every man," the ghost returned, "that the spirit within him should walk abroad amongst his fellow men, and travel far and wide, and if that spirit goes not forth in life, it is condemned to do so after death. It is doomed to wander through the world, Oh, woe is me, and witness what it cannot share, but might have shared on earth and turned to happiness. Again the spectre raised a cry, and shook its chain and wrung its shadowy hands. You are fettered, said Scrooge, trembling. Tell me why. I wear the chain I forged in life, replied the ghost. I made it link by link, and yard by yard. I girded it on my own free will, and of my own free will I wore it. Is its pattern strange to you? Or would you know, pursued the ghost, as Scrooge trembled more and more, the weight and the length of the strong coil you bear yourself? It was full as heavy and as long as this 7 Christmas Eves ago. You have labored on it since. It is a ponderous chain. Scrooge glanced about him on the floor, in the expectation of finding himself surrounded by some 50 or 60 fathoms of iron cable, but could see nothing. Jacob, he said imploringly, old Jacob Marley, tell me more. Speak comfort to me, Jacob. I have none to give, the ghost replied. It comes from other regions, Ebenezer Scrooge, and is conveyed by other ministers to other kinds of men. Nor can I tell you what I would. A very little more is all permitted to me. I cannot rest. I cannot stay. I cannot linger anywhere. My spirit never walked beyond our counting house, mark me. In my life, my spirit never roved beyond the narrow limits of our money-changing hole, and our weary journeys lie before me. It was a habit with Scrooge. Whenever he became thoughtful, he put his hands on his breech pockets, pondering on how the ghost, pondering on what the ghost had said. He did so now, but without lifting up his eyes or getting off his knees. You must have been very slow about it, Jacob, Scrooge observed in a businesslike manner, though with humility and deference. Slow, the ghost repeated. 7 years dead, mused Scrooge, and traveling all the time? The whole time, said the ghost. No rest, no peace, no incessant torture of remorse. You travel fast? Said Scrooge. On the wings of the wind, replied the ghost. You might have gotten over a great quantity of ground in 7 years, said Scrooge. The ghost, on hearing this, set up another cry and clanked its chain so hideously in the dead silence of the night that the ward would have been justified in indicting it for a nuisance. "Oh, captive bound and double-bound iron," cried the phantom, "not to know the ages of incessant labor by immortal creatures, for this earth must pass into eternity before the good of which it would be susceptible to all its developed. Not to know that any Christian spirit walking kindly in this little sphere, whatever it may be, will find its mortal life too short for its vast means of usefulness. Not to know that no space of regret can make amends for one's life's opportunity misused. Yet such was I. Oh, such was I." But you were always a good man of business, Jacob," faltered Scrooge, who now began to apply this to himself. "Business!" cried the ghost, wringing its hands again. "Mankind was my business. The common welfare was my business. Charity, mercy, forbearance, and benevolence were all my business, the dealings of which my trade were but a drop in the water of the comprehensive oceans of my business." It held up its chains again at arm's length, as if that were the cause of all of its unavailing grief, and flung it at heavy upon the ground again. "At this time of the rolling year," the spectre said, "I suffer most. Why did I walk through crowds of my fellow beings with my eyes turned down, and never raise them to that blessed star which led the wise men to a poor abode? Were there no poor homes to which its light would have conducted me?" Scrooge was very much dismayed to hear the spectre going on at this rate, and began to quake exceedingly. "Hear me," cried the ghost. "My time is nearly gone." I will," said Scrooge. "But don't be hard upon me. Don't be flowery, Jacob, pray." How is it that I appear before you? Oh, wait, hold up. I was talking. Ghost, 1 second. How is it that I appear before you in a shape that you can see? I may not tell. I have sat invisible beside you many and many a day. It was not an agreeable idea. Scrooge shivered and wiped the perspiration from his brow. Words. That is no light part of my penance, pursued the ghost. I am here tonight to warn you that you have yet a chance and a hope of escaping my fate, a chance and hope of my procuring Ebenezer. You are always a good friend to me, said Scrooge. Thank you. You will be haunted, resumed the ghost, by 3 spirits. He said, look, man, I'm here to help you out. He's like, oh my gosh, you're doing me such a solid. Thanks, man. Yeah, you're going to be haunted tonight by 3 ghosts. You're welcome, King. Scrooge's countenance fell almost as low as the ghost's had done. Is that the chance and hope you mentioned, Jacob? He demanded in a faltering voice. It is. I think I'd rather not, said Scrooge. Without their visits, said the ghost, you cannot hope to shun the path I tread. Expect the first tomorrow when the bell tolls 1. Couldn't I take them all at once and have them over, Jacob? Hinted Scrooge. Expect the second on the night next at the same hour. The third upon the next night, when the last stroke of 12 has ceased to vibrate. Look to see me no more, and look that for your own sake you remember what has passed between us. When it had said these words, the spectre took its wrapper from the table and bound its round head as before. Scrooge knew this by the smart sound its teeth made when the jaws were brought together by the bandage. He ventured to raise his eyes again and found his supernatural visitor confronting him in an erect attitude with its chain wound above its arm. The apparition walked backward from him, and at every step it took, the window raised itself a little, so that when the spectre reached it, it was wide open. It beckoned Scrooge to approach, which he did, and they were within 2 paces of each other. Marley's ghost held up its hand, warning him to come no nearer, and Scrooge stopped. Not so much in obedience, but as in surprise and fear, for on the raising of the hand, he became sensible and confused noises in the air, incoherent sounds of lamentation and regret, wailings inexpressibly sorrowful and self-accusatory. The spectre, after listening for a moment, joined the mournful dirge, and floated out upon the bleak, dark night. Scrooge followed to the window. Desperate in his curiosity, he looked out. The air was filled with phantoms, wandering hither and thither in restless haste, and moaning as they went. Every one of them wore chains like Marley's ghost. Some few, they might be guilty governments, were linked together. None were free. Many had personally been known to Scrooge in their lives. He had been quite familiar with one old ghost in a white waistcoat with a monstrous iron safe attached to his ankle, who cried piteously at being unable to assist a wretched woman with an infant whom it saw below upon a doorstep. The misery with them was all clear. They sought to interfere for good in human matters, and had lost the power to do so forever. Whether these creatures faded into mist, or mist enshrouded them, he could not tell. But they and their spirit voices faded together, and the night became as it had been when he walked home. Scrooge closed the window. He examined the door by which the ghost had entered. It was double locked, and he had locked it with his own hands, and the bolts were undisturbed. He tried to say humbug, but stopped at the first syllable. And being from the emotion that he had undergone, or the fatigues of the day, or his glimpse of the invisible world, or the dull conversation of the ghost, or even the lateness of the hour, much in need of repose, he went straight to bed, without undressing, and fell asleep upon the instant. End of chapter 1. So, I'm gonna bookmark it here so I don't lose it. So yeah, the Old English, that's always an adjustment, I feel. I do enjoy reading like old British classics such as like, Pride and Prejudice, Jane Eyre, I'm a Jane Austen fan. I'll be completely honest about that. I do love me some Jane Austen. But even Shakespeare, like the Old English. I don't know if anybody had to read with those No Fear Shakespeare books before, but the No Fear Shakespeare was helpful and kind of life saving to me in school at least. But that was the first chapter of, or in this case, in the 1843 version, the first stave of A Christmas Carol. But it's really interesting to kind of see how, the parallels don't really ever seem to end between current reality versus the story. And it's kind of interesting, I think, to think about of how Victorian society was kind of almost just as indifferent as we sometimes can be today. But also just, the overall moral of A Christmas Carol is to just, be a nice human. don't be a Grinch or a Scrooge. But even still, just rereading it, I always find it so refreshing. And I know my brother, that's like one of his, he likes the newer Disney remake of A Christmas Carol with Jim Carrey. It is very well done. And they do a good job keeping it really well to how the book was actually written. But yeah, that was good. It's just the denial for me I find so funny of like, no, there's no ghost, what? But anyways, that was the first chapter. Let me know what you guys think, if you like how I read, if there's anything I can improve on, my enunciation, or even just like, I want to try to get better at doing different voices in the story to kind of distinguish the characters a little bit. My mom used to actually do that for me when she would read to me as a kid. Was she would always try to do like different voices for the characters, or at least change the cadence or the tone to make it, a little more distinguishable. But I hope you guys have a great night, and hopefully this, can be a fun little bedtime story. And looking forward to reading more as the Christmas season goes on, and my cat is scratching, so that means it's her bedtime. But thank you guys so much for tuning in and watching, and I will catch you in the next video. Bye!